Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview series. Today, I'm super excited. I will be interviewing a very special scholar, Professor Omid Safi from the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Duke University, USA. Um, I'm going to shortly tell you about the topic, but before I get to it, let's welcome the professor, and we have many exciting questions. Hello, Professor, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you, Rasul Jan, and thank you for taking this time for us to have a conversation about such a beautiful and sublime topic.
I'm honored, and I'm sure the audience will enjoy this discussion. Now, we're going to be talking about a very interesting original work that Professor Safi has written, Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition. Professor, on page 5, you quote, you talk about Ahmad Ghazali, and then you bring this text. I will write you a book on radical love, provided you do not bifurcate it into divine love and human love. That's a beautiful, beautiful passage, but it also raises questions. You're highlighting Ghazali's warning not to bifurcate love into divine and human. Yet in the scholarship, we always say divine love, human love, as if you're separating them. How does this refusal to divide became central to Mazhab Eshq?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is really
Yeah.
the crux of the issue, and part of the reason for the confusion and sometimes the unhelpful language that is introduced is that, we're always in a rush to speak of something like the Sufi tradition as if it is one unified whole. And it's not. It has many different flavors, many different eruptions, many different um, tastes, zokes. So it's true that the earlier Sufi tradition, which never disappears, and in many places and in many parts of the world, it remains the dominant tradition. And truth be told, it also doesn't entirely disappear from Maulana's own writings. That earlier tradition talks about the existence of two modalities of Eshq. There's the Eshq majazi, metaphorical love, and Eshq haqiqi, real love. And the way that they tended to talk about it was that Eshq majazi, metaphorical love, is the love that you and I would share. It's the love that creation, humanity would share. Whereas Eshq haqiqi is really God's love and the love for God. So in that earlier tradition, it's true. There is a bifurcation that is made. You can almost think of it as Eshq majazi, metaphorical love. It's like the individual letters of the alphabet. You have to master it before you can compose a sonnet, a ghazal. Now, that tradition, which as I mentioned, never entirely goes away. And it's not unusual to see references to it in Maulana's own teachings, particularly when he's addressing the soul, when the soul is still caught up in its egoic structure, right? So if what you really end up loving about another person is not really their soul, but it's just, the attractiveness of their physical form, well, then, Maulana is likely to tell you that that physical form is going to die and it's going to change. And that the one who's a beautiful beloved today in 30 and 40 years will look like a grandpa or a grandma. And wouldn't you
Right.
do better to turn to the one uh, whose love is haqiqi and is beyond um, fading, right? So that those kind of references are there, but that's because the nafs at that level can only see the surat, can only see the external form, and it has not yet learned to see the surat and the ma'na, the form and the formless, that which manifests and the hidden inner meaning together simultaneously. Where does Ahmad Ghazali come into play? So, as I think your audience surely would know, we owe to Ahmad the fact that he writes the first Persian book on Eshq, the Savaneh, which Ustad Purjavadi and Helmut Ritter have both edited, and Ustad Purjavadi translated it almost 50 years ago. And when Ahmad starts out writing of this book, in the introduction, he has to talk about why has he decided to write this book. Now, this was always an issue for pre-modern Muslim writers. Nowadays, contemporary people, myself included, the minute we have a thought, we have to put it on YouTube so that everybody knows that, oh, look, I had a thought. Whereas our pre-modern ancestors realized that writing is always an act of ego. At least it includes an element of ego. And so the question is, why write? And the most common answer that we got, this is almost a literary trope, is if it was up to me, I would have never written. But there were these friends, and they begged me, they pleaded with me
Right.
for their benefit to write something. So,
Right.
and this is exactly what Ahmad does. And there's no reason, by the way, to see this as a mere literary device. No one doubts that there was actually a friend who said, oh, Ahmad, when I'm with you, God is real, love is real, all of this is real. And then I go home and I forget. So write me something that I can go home and keep this feeling alive, right? That happens in any spiritual gathering. And so Ahmad writes him this book, which we have now as the Savaneh. And then he starts out by saying that I'm going to write this book in a few chapters on the ma'ani eshq, on the inner meanings of eshq, of radical love, even though the reality of love cannot be made to fit into words. Love is something that you have to live into, something that you have to give um, experience to. And he uses very erotic language, right? He says it's as if the inner meaning of love is like a virgin bride, and that the hand of men have not even touched her hem, her skirt, right? It's the language of longing, of union, of reaching, of needing, of desiring, of longing for that inner meaning. And so he says, my task is to create a wedding chamber when words about love and the
Amazing.
inner experience of love can have union, right? So
Amazing.
it's this highly sensual, even writing itself is a sensual metaphor for him. And he says, so, I'm going to create this wedding chamber. I'm going to write you this book on Eshq on one condition. And that's the passage that you read about. He says, چنانکه تعلق به هیچ جانب ندارد در حقایق عشق و احوال و اغراض عشق، به شرط آنکه در او هیچ حواله نبود، نه به خالق و نه به مخلوق. So I'll write you this book on love as long as you don't try to restrict it to as if this ishq is only about the khaliq, the creator, or only about the makhluk, creation. So he's talking about something else. He's talking about something a little bit more subtle. I always tell my students that this is like the reggae musician Bob Marley, who has that great song "One Love." I was like, we did one love. We did one love 1,000 years ago. Rather than seeing love as two, love as split, Ahmad al-Ghazali is telling us that there's one love. And later on in the Savaneh, in the 58th chapter, he uses reference to the Quran. So every Sufi book on love comes back to that ayah from the Quran, from Surah Al-Ma'idah, um, and in that modern Muslim way where people identify things by chapter and verse, chapter 5, verse 54. No pre-modern Muslim ever gave chapter and verse. This is such a Protestant
Right.
disease
Right.
that has infected all of us. Um, they just expected that you were familiar with the Quran, and if you're not, then you shouldn't be reading this book. Um,
They don't even
and
cite. They don't
no,
even
that's right.
cite. So
There's
just
no,
recite
yeah,
and move on.
that's it. And they don't give you the whole verse, right?
Right.
It's just enough for them to say يحبهم
Hmm.
يحبهم, and you should know
Hmm.
the rest of it. Or if they're citing hadith, it's enough to say kanzan makhfiyan,
Right.
and you should know
Reminds me
that
of
this
Ibn
is
Arabi. He doesn't care at
absolutely,
all about citation. Like when Ibn
absolutely.
Arabi writes,
Yeah,
he's just amazing.
because they're swimming in it, because they're so
Right.
in the ocean that they expect their audience to be as well. So that verse of the Quran, God will bring forth a people. God loves them and they love God. Yohibbuhum va yohibbunahu. Every Sufi who writes about love comes back to this verse, right? It's and what they love about it, of course, is that it uses the root word of hub, mahabba or mohabbat, as we would say in Persian, to talk about this model of one love. And what does Ahmad al-Ghazali say in the Savaneh? He's trying to make the argument that God's love for us and the love that we express are actually one. So he talks about it through this beautiful metaphor of gardening. Gardening. Asl ishq as qadam rabad. So the root of love has come from non-existence, from pre-eternity. And he says, it's as if, and he takes the letter B, which in Arabic and Persian has a noqte, a dot under it, right? So hub is ha and be. And he says, it's as if the noqte, the dot under the be of yuhibbuhum, God loves them, has been planted in the fertile soil of yuhibbunahu, and we love God. یحبهم به تخمی در زمین یحبونه افکندند. And this is done actually in the home, in them, in us, in humanity, until we love has emerged from it. And then this is the key. When the flower of Eshq, of radical love, comes out, so very subtly he's shifted from the Quranic language of hub to the quite distinctly Persian and Persianate language of Ishq, radical love. When it comes out, the seed is of the same color as the fruit. The seed, تخم همرنگ ثمره بود و ثمره همرنگ تخم. In other words, the love that God has planted in the soil of our soul, the love that God has planted in the soil of our soul leads forth to a flower, to a fruit, human love, which is of the same color and the same essence and the same nature as divine love. Right? So he's not talking about this the way that a peripatetic philosopher would. Right? There's no discussion really of Aristotelian
Right.
categories. He's talking about it using the language of myth, poetry, and symbols, which has always been the a beauty of our tradition.
Wonderful. I do agree. And this love is so unique that many people from outside the tradition usually mistake it. They mistake it to the physical love or the worldly love alone. I mean, like reducing it to physicality alone. Yes, that too can become like a doorway to the divine love. We're not separating it, like the whole
Yeah.
discussion you have in this book, but still, like limiting it to that level is doing injustice.
One of the main reasons I think for that flattening in certain pockets, I'm not saying this is true for all Iranians, of course, or all Persian speakers, but it's true in certain pockets, is that we largely read Hazrat Maulana through his poetry, right? What we don't do is to situate the poetry in what we know about his life. So the two biographies of Hazrat Maulana that we have, the one by Aflaki, Manaqib al-Arifin, and the one by Sipah Salar, they provide hundreds and hundreds of pages of detail about his life. And once we situate the love poetry in the context of what we know about his life, once we also read his Friday sermons in the Majalis, well, then we get a much richer sense of that perspective.
You know, in our conversation before the meeting, I said that I'm working on the problem of evil and suffering from perspective of Rumi and John Hick. Um, I came across this passage in Fihi Ma Fihi, and it was very interesting to me to see Rumi, the love intoxicated poet, gives rational argumentation
Of course.
about the problem of evil, about the free will. And it was so interesting to me. So I agree. When we put that poem in the context of his life, in the context of our writings, different things emerge. Um,
Can I add one example just before we
please,
move on to the next topic?
please,
This is one
please.
of my favorite ones um, because it's such a real life example, and it really does go against this image of Hazrat Maulana as this, free loving, tripped out hippie that sometimes he's represented as being. In his letters, there's a very tender, very moving episode where his own son is coming to him and he's saying to his Baba, Baba, I am caught up in this loveless marriage. My wife doesn't seem to care for me. And guess what? I found this other woman, and she's everything that I want. And she's so beautiful. And I feel so excited when I'm near her. So you're always talking about Eshq. Can I have permission to go and chase this other woman? Very interesting to see what he would say. And he writes a letter to him and he says, my dear son, the light of my eyes, the love of my life, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't. What you are chasing is a mirage in a desert. It appears like the sweet water of life to you, but the more you chase it, the more it will retreat from you. The love that you seek is right at home waiting for you. Take your longing, take your desire, invest it in your home. And then he ends the letter by saying, um, free your father from worrying about you so that I can return to praying for you. Right? Now,
Wow,
that
wow.
Rumi, that Hazrat Maulana doesn't really fit our
Mhm.
model uh, of, this hippie free love um, California American mystic. And of course, it always has to be said, he's writing a letter to his son, right? This is not advice
Mhm.
that is true for all people of all time who might find
Mhm.
themselves in a loveless marriage, but to his son,
Right.
in that particular saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't. Free your father from worrying about you so I can return to praying for you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have not seen that passage. It was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I have a spontaneous question, which is going to be tying kind of to my next question. So the spontaneous question is, why the radical love? Um, but the question following that is this. I would like to quote a part of the book, a beautiful, beautiful paragraph. You say on page 1, for the mystics of the path of radical love, love, that is Eshq in Farsi, is not a sentiment or an emotion. It is the very overflowing of God onto this realm, that is the material world. It is this radical love that erupts out of God, bringing us into being, emphasizing, bringing us into being. It is this love that sustains us, and it will be the cosmic current that will carry us back home. That's a powerful paragraph, and there are so many things going on there. Kind of reminds us of Plotinus's emanation theory or the Sudur theory, as we like to call it in Islamic thought. But um, first, how does this framing change our usual understanding of spirituality and everyday affection? And two, how does this perspective reconcile the real's transcendence and immanence in relation to the world? So,
Yeah.
overall, three questions, starting
Okay.
with the radical. What radical?
Of course, of course. Well, of course, that word radical has taken on a whole new connotation,
Right.
particularly when it comes to Islam and Muslims. And
Yes.
I was recently told, by the way, I have a podcast where we talk about these things, and the provider called it. It wasn't the title I chose. Sufi heart. And I had
Mm.
asked them when we started it, I was like, well, I really want it to be called Radical Love because the book is Radical Love and the podcast would go along with it. And they said, well, we tried to register the name Radical Love, but the name got rejected because they thought that a Muslim author,
Right.
speaker, talking about something radical has a very
Right.
different kind of a connotation. They thought it
Right.
would trigger all kinds of
Wow.
terrorism watch. And so, I mean,
Wow.
even when you're talking about love and Eshq and Rumi, that's still the world in which we live.
I
Um,
will never forget that.
yeah, yeah. So, but I'm a scholar. I love languages, and so I pay attention to the etymology of words. So the word radical, of course, has two meanings. One of them is something that is extreme. But then the older meaning of it is to go back to the roots of something. That's the English etymology of radical, which, when you start to think about Molana starting the Masnavi with هذا كتاب المثنوي وهو أصول الدين, right? This is the root of the root of the root of religion. If you wanted to translate it, you could say that what Molana is saying in the first line of the Masnavi is that this is the Masnavi and this is some radical, radical, radical stuff, right? That's what it is to go back to the root of something. And then the Sufis themselves, when they were asked to distinguish between hub or mahabba, muhibbat, and ishq, right? Sometimes, as Molana does in the Masnavi, they're like, oh, they both mean the same thing. But most often they said, Eshq is ifratul mahabba. Eshq is muhabba when it goes beyond the bounds, when it refuses to be contained, right? So there's that sense of love when it becomes overflowing, when it becomes abundant. Um, and then, as far as the God being unleashed on earth. Look, ever since Plotinus, one of the questions that many religious traditions have had to grapple with is how is the one related to the many? How do you get the oneness of God and the apparent manyness of creation. And we have different answers to this, right? We have the Wahdat al-Wujud tradition, a term that Ibn Arabi himself doesn't seem to have used, but it becomes associated with his school, which takes being, wujud, but remembering that being is not some European kind of static notion, that for Sufis, wujud always has a sense of vajd, which is ecstasy, right? There's something ecstatic about the universe coming into being, which I think sometimes we forget when we read Sufism in light of a Western philosophical tradition, right?
which is a lot.
Which is a lot, yeah. It's probably because many of the scholars who study Islamic philosophy, their initial training is in Western philosophy, right? And
Right, I agree.
and so we have that.
I was also like that.
Uh,
I'm afraid I was also like that. It took years to, reset.
you've detoxified
Yes, but
from
after
that.
years.
Yes, and we have the Ishraqi tradition of Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, where Nur is the metaphor that we use to talk about the relationship of the one and the many. And here, of course, in the Mazhab Eshq tradition, love is the way that the one and the many are related to one another. The way that someone like a Maulana Rumi talks about this is not through a theological discussion, but again, it's through poetry. And so there's a poem that I have in the book on page 73. Um, Persian audiences would know this one, of course. It is unforgettable because of the recitation of great masters like the late Ustad Shajarian, Man ghulam qamaram, ghayr qamar hich magu, right? I serve
Mm.
that moon-like beauty, say nothing to me unless it's about her. And, that poem is such a powerful gift for us. In it, Maulana uh, is having an experience, a visionary experience, a dreamlike experience of witnessing love, Eshq, being embodied in this most beautiful form. دوش دیوانه شدم عشق مرا دید و بگفت آمدم نعره مزن جام مدر هیچ مگو. I've come, don't shout, don't tear your clothes apart, هیچ مگو, say nothing. And that's the refrain of the poem, say nothing, which is sweetly ironic for a poet who writes 60,000 lines of poetry,
Right,
right?
right.
That's the finger pointing at the moon, that the task of poetry is not to exhaust God, it's to take you to that inner space where God is revealed in silence, right?
Mhm.
And then, he says, "Goftam ey ishq, man az cheez digar mitarsam." I said, "Oh, love, I'm afraid of something else." And Ishq says, "Goft an cheez digar neest, digar hich magu." There is nothing else. I'm all there is. I am all. Love is all. And then, Rumi starts to, through the narrator of the poem, he starts to figure out, well, what is this being that I'm having this dialogue with? Are you a ferishte? Are you an
Yeah,
angel? Are you a bashar? Are you a human creature? And he's like, no, no, I'm not an angel. I'm not a human. And he starts to go a little crazy. He's like, I'm zero zebar khoham shod. And he's like, okay, stay right there. Stay in that
right,
burning. And then here comes the clincher line of the poem. گفتم ای دل پدری کن نه که این وصف خداست. I said, have some mercy.
mm,
Treat me lovingly like a parent would.
mm,
Isn't what you're describing the quality of God? نه که این وصف خداست.
mm,
گفت این هست ولی جان پدر
mm,
هیچ مگو. Says it is, but the
mm.
soul of your father, like my beloved offspring, say nothing.
Wow,
And
I never thought of that poem like in that connection. Wow,
yeah, and that's
like
something that, of course,
Vasfe Khuda.
Vasf Khodas, right?
Wow.
And that's something that we get in the Mazhab Eshq tradition, where they gently take you from thinking about our task is to love God, right? That we are the ashiq and God is the mashuq. And the Mazhab Ishq tradition says, no, God himself, herself is ashiq, ishq, and
Mhm.
mashuq. It is God who loves God through us. And Abul Hasan Kharagani has a beautiful, beautiful way that he explains this. And I'll just pause after this. Um, he gets to that quintessential passage in the Quran, which is really the seat of our whole spiritual experience, the Alastu Barabbakum.
Mhm.
Am I not your cherishing, sustaining Lord? And the whole goal of our spiritual life, the whole goal of zikr, the whole goal of sama, the whole goal of contemplation and meditation is to return to that original pure state where we beheld God. Hmm? And Kharagani says, we were all there, every human being who's ever been, we were all there together, witnessing and beholding God as the Shahid, as the beautiful beloved, but we heard it according to our capacity. And so he says, some of us heard God asking, am I not your Rab? Am I not your Lord? Am I not the one who cherishes you, sustains you, nurtures you? And we all said yes. He says, a little bit above that are the ones who heard it as, am I not your doost? Am I not
Mm.
your friend? Am I not the one who loves you? Doost. And of course,
Wow.
doost is one of the Mazhab Eshq code words for God.
Mhm.
Um,
Rumi uses all the time.
all the time, all the time.
Mhm.
Every whirling dervishes ceremony, right?
Mhm.
Samo ceremony starts out with Ya Hazrat Maulana Haq Doost, right? It's a
Mhm.
pun. Haq Doost. God is my friend, but Maulana is the Doost of Haq. And the Sufis always remind us that the very last word uttered by the Blessed Prophet, the chosen one, Hazrat Mustafa, alayhi salatu wassalam, was Ar-Rafiq al-Ala, the highest friend,
Mhm.
right? I choose the highest friend. So the second meaning is, am I not your doost? Am I not your friend? But then Kharabani says, and there's a special rank of people who heard Alastu Birabbikum as God saying, am I not all? Am I not the only being? Am I not the only thing that is in existence? Now,
Wow.
and that's his three-level interpretation of Rab,
Amazing.
Doost, Hame.
Thank you so much for that poem. And it was all spontaneous, but this is the poem that has kept me, awake at nights. There's this part of it that I've been stuck for years. But that part that you mentioned is an amazing link. That last part where Rumi said, I said, my heart, isn't this God's quality?
Yeah.
You're saying that here he's referring to love as God's quality.
Ishq as
That
Vasf
is
Khuda.
huge.
Yeah. And
That is
and
huge.
that's an example of, in order to understand that reference, we have to know that
Mhm.
Hazrat Maulana has read Attar,
Right.
and Attar talks about God as Hameust. And then Hazrat Maulana is intimately familiar with um, Kharaqani, whom, at one point in the Masnavi, when he's asked to describe him, he just calls him Nur, 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 six times. He just says, what can I
Mm.
say about him? He was light of light of light of light of light of light of light. And so he's coming from the Khorasan region that Kharaqani comes from. He's familiar with the teachings of Kharaqani. And the more we see Hazrat Maulana as an heir to this century-long tradition of Qaraqani and Abu Sa'id and Ahmad al-Ghazali and Ain al-Ghazat and Attar and Sana'i, I think the better we understand his
Mm,
references.
beautiful. Uh, you gave me a lot to contemplate there. So let me ask you a question from here, the part that I'm stuck.
Okay.
Um, Rumi is having this dialogue with God, as Professor Safi pointed out. And this dialogue goes on and on and on. Amazing, amazing poem. One of Rumi's most elegant poems.
Hmm.
از قمری جان صفتی در ره دل پیدا شد در ره دل چه لطیف است سفر هیچ مگو just the translation off the top of my head a moon-like figure appeared on the path of love on the path of love how sweet it is journeying something like that I'm just
Yeah,
paraphrasing
sure.
then see here it says قمری جان صفتی پیدا شد a moon-like figure appeared then he's in wonder گفتم ای عشق Rumi is asking love گفتم ای عشق گفتم ای عشق عجب این روی فرشته است عجب یا بشر است is this the figure or face of an angel or human see there's a personhood there that
Yep,
is important there
that's
is a
right.
personhood there
Yep, yep.
we cannot say oh that's just love no it's not we're talking about a personhood گفتین غیر فرشته است و بشر هیچ نگو as you have translated, love said, not an angel, not a human, say nothing. So what is that? What category is that? I've been stuck with this question for a long, long time. Not a
Yeah,
human, not an angel. We cannot say it's something ontological, like love, an ontological force, because of the personhood. And Rumi loves doing that. He doesn't answer it. He leaves it open.
yeah, yeah. So I can give you an insight about how someone like Ain al-Ghazat can get you unstuck here, right? So this is the insight that Ain al-Ghazat has in the Tamhidat. Okay. And he takes you back. One of the main reasons that I'm so fascinated by Ain al-Ghazat is Ahmad al-Ghazali. Reading Ahmad al-Ghazali is a little bit like reading Platonic dialogues, right? It's a beautiful, dense prose impregnated with a few lines of poetry here and there. What Ain al-Ghazat, Ahmad al-Ghazali's, of course, student, and it's the picture of the two of them that's on the cover of the Radical Love book. What Ain al-Ghazat does is to make explicit everything that Ahmad al-Ghazali has been talking about by connecting it, or I would say revealing the Quranic and the Hadith references. So almost every line or every other line of the Tamhidat includes a reference to the Quran or a reference to the Hadith al-Qudsi or the prophetic Hadith collections. And when he gets to talking about the story of Hazrat Maryam in the Quran, like Virgin Mary, he does something really beautiful. So this is in Surah Maryam, named after Virgin Mary. And he talks about how Hazrat Maryam retreats to a place in the east when the time comes to give birth to Hazrat Isa, to Jesus. And she secludes herself, right? فاتخذت من دونهم حجابا فأرسلنا إليها روحنا فتمثل لها بشرا سويا. So God saying, we sent our spirit, which is one of the, of course, titles of Hazrat Isa is Ruhullah. We sent our spirit to Maryam فتمثل. تمثل. And this spirit comes to take on the form of a creature. And then Ain al-Ghazat and some other Sufis, I think Ibn Arabi also has a reference to this as well. Tamathala is the form of a mithal. misal. It allegorizes
Imaginal
itself.
form.
That's right. So, I mean, in
Mhm.
one tradition, it goes on to the whole alam misal and what have
Mhm.
you, but literary wise, it's also an allegory. It's the way that the formless comes to clothe itself at the level of forms.
Wow.
And again, there's no uniformity in all of the Sufi tradition. Sometimes they say things like, and Maulana himself says things like, the goal is to get over the surat and to see the ma'na. Sometimes he says things like, the goal is to get over the foam on top of the
Mhm.
ocean and to dive deep into the ocean where the pearls are. I think that's one voice. And another voice is to hold together the John and the Tan, the body and the soul, to simultaneously make space for the Surat and the Ma'na. And in that context, the form, the level of form, is not something to be discarded. It is a bridge that you keep walking across to get to the inner realities, and you walk back. And the form is also of God. And so, for example, surat form is tied to one of the divine names, Ya Musawwir.
Right. Right.
So the surat cannot be entirely discarded any more than any of the divine names could ever be
We have
discarded.
divine name al-Zahir,
That's right. And the
outward,
batin. That's right.
very explicit,
Yeah,
not interpretation.
that's right. That's right. And Attar has a wonderful story. I wish I could remember which Sufi it is that he's talking about, but he talks about a Sufi who's walking around, and as a meditation, he keeps repeating himself, Ya batin, Ya batin. Oh, the hidden inward, the hidden inward. And the voice that he hears from heaven is and az-Zahir, and az-Zahir. God is not
Wow.
only the hidden inward, God is
Mhm.
also. And I won't name names, but I do think this has been an issue in the study of the Sufi tradition, which is quite pervasive, which is sometimes people who tend to prioritize what they might term as the esoteric dimension really see the external, the manifest, the form, the
Mhm.
imaged as something shallow, something
Mhm.
that is ultimately to be transcended. And I don't think the Mazhab Eshq tradition is really one ultimately of transcendence. I think it is to find the harmony between the form and the formless, between transcendence and immanence, between the love of God and the love of creation. And that's the reason why we're not ultimately called to abandon family, to abandon community, to abandon relationship and go sit on the mountaintop. We are intended to sanctify where we are through the presence that endures.
Beautiful. It reminded me of part of Fih Ma Fih. Rumi talks about monasticism there, and very respectful towards Christianity and
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. And then he, given that he's talking about monasticism, he says the prophet of Christianity's path was that of monasticism, but the Prophet Muhammad says, my path differs in a sense that God showed me a better way. That is marriage. And that
Yeah.
was shocking for me. This is Rumi, like the Rumi that we see on the West usually, is that you should see your spouse as a self cleanser.
Yeah.
in an inward sense. Your kid gets on your nerves, your spouse makes you angry. That's purifying you, and vice versa. That's a mutual relationship. And that's a wonderful perspective. It brings spirituality right into your home, right
Absolutely.
into your, family
Absolutely.
life.
Absolutely. Let me give two very short references for this that I think are helpful. The goal is not somehow to arrive at this impersonal model of
Mm,
spirituality, but one that holds room and space for something that is relational, that is familial, that is based on actual love of real human beings, and not just merely
right,
the archetype. You don't sit there
right.
meditating on the archetype of love. You also have to learn to love real, messy, complicated, difficult human beings. This is one of my favorite metaphors of Hazrat Maulana, one of the favorite stories of Hazrat Maulana. And it's really these kinds of stories that I would love to see Iranian audiences take to heart more. It comes up from Aflaki, from Manaqib al-Arifin. So this is an early story. It's compiled from people who are gathering the story from people who knew Molana, right? This is not some apocryphal thing centuries down the road. Um, and the story is about Molana and his wife when Molana is approaching death. And it's clear that his time on Earth is coming to an end, um, and it's time to return home. And Aflaki includes a passage from the point of view of his wife. And she is absolutely devastated, completely beside herself, weeping. And she calls him Jan Jahanam, right? You're the soul of my whole world. Where am I going to find another one like you? How am I ever going to love anyone with your deep and volcanic love again?
Beautiful,
Right?
beautiful.
And he, because he's Hazrat Maulana, he writes a poem for her. And
In
so
deathbed.
on the deathbed, because why not? And the
Yeah,
poem is, I'll give it in a translation. He says this: in this world, I have had two attachments. One has been to my body, the other has been to you. The time has come for two-ness to become unity, and I am now asked to let go of one of these attachments.
wow.
So I'm letting go of the body so that the soul can return home. As for the love that you and I have shared, that love had no beginning and it will have no end, and I am yours forever.
Amazingly beautiful.
Yeah. I think
Incredible.
that's mazhab Eshq. That's
Right.
someone who loves God, loves his community, loves Shams, and loves his wife with this eternal love where death is only a door, and we walk through that door and find the same love in another garden.
Incredibly beautiful. Thank you very much for this.
Alhamdulillah.
Professor, I know you don't have much time. I really, really appreciate the time you took out of your busy schedule to enlighten me and the audience who will be listening to this. Professor, thank you very much again for accepting this interview, for spending this much time with us. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
حتما عزیزم خیلی ممنون. Thank you so much, with
Bye,
much love and
Subhana.
appreciation to you all. All
Thank
right.
you too.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye. Bye bye.